Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Family Writing Journey. I'm Michael.
I'm Sunny.
And I'm Matthew.
We're a dad, a mom, and a teenage son. We each recently took up fiction writing. We're definitely not experts, but we hope you'll enjoy hearing about our journey and maybe get inspired to start your own. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Family Writing Journey. Today, the three of us will be talking about story types. And by story types, I mean sort of the general things that we're working on and that we could work on. Short stories, novellas, or novels. And then if we are talking about novel route, we'll talk about series a little bit and that type of writing. So for myself, I don't have too much experience with the other things, but what about short stories?
Well, a short story is basically a story that is short. It's between about 1,000 or 7,000 words, something like that, in that range. And obviously, based on the format of that, it has to have more of a condensed plot. You can only focus on one or two characters, one or two plot points, and you're just sort of exploring that in a short format.
So I know Michael said he doesn't have any short story experience. I
No.
have just a little bit, and that's because Matthew suggested it to me a while back when I was really just trying to break the ice and just try to write anything. And so you at that time, Matthew, I think already had some experience with short story.
It's true. I'd gotten the advice from Ray Bradbury, the famous sci-fi fantasy author, classic sci-fi fantasy now, I guess. And he's recommended that you should write a ton of short stories. His model was writing one each week. So then at the end of a year, you would have 52 short stories. And even if 51 of them were bad, you would at least have some good work that you produced. And I sort of followed that model starting at the beginning of 2020, I guess. And I didn't write short stories for the full year, but I did about one a week for the first couple months at least. And I thought it was great because I got to write a bunch of different types of stories, and it really allowed for a lot of experimentation, doing different things. I could try first person versus third person. I could try just exploring different things without being too committed to any of them.
Did you notice that your writing improved, or was that a goal, or did you just want to explore and just see what happened?
Well, I mostly wanted to explore. That was the intent, but looking back now, I can certainly see like my early short stories are really bad writing wise. Some of the ideas are cool and I might want to rework them in the future at some point, but the writing itself has improved a lot through that process.
That sounds actually really smart. I had no idea you had written that many short stories. I knew you had, and I knew even years ago you and your brothers would write, but I had no idea you had written so much. And actually, for the family writing journey, it actually sounds really smart to write short stories. That said, it never even occurred to me, to be honest. I just thought, oh, well, if you're going to write, you can write a book.
I think that's how a lot of people think. But actually, a short story can give you that experience of like starting something and seeing it through. So like you have the idea that I'm someone who can finish something. Whereas starting with a novel, that's a lot harder.
I totally agree, because I tried Matthew's approach. I did not do one a week. I think my goal was to do one a month, and I did that for 3 or 4 months. So I wrote 3 or 4 short stories, and it was manageable. It felt like, for me, it kind of broke me through my fear of trying to write something. And I didn't really worry about how good it was, or I didn't know or care about genre or any kind of story techniques or anything. I just kind of wrote. And like you said, I wrote one in the first person. I wrote something in the third person. I wrote different, one was kind of fantasy.
You can try different genres, yeah.
One was just like a very, very sort of simple everyday life. So it was fun. I liked it. I didn't keep up with it. And then I had sort of a gap before I tried for a novel.
This is going to sound funny, but I'm almost more intimidated by a short story, because I don't know the psychology here. Maybe it's just that writing a novel, I'm expected to be bad at and have it come out. But a short story, I feel like, boy, if I can't do a good short story, I don't know. It's just some of my own
That was
baggage.
The whole thing that Ray Bradbury was saying. That was like, you write a bunch of them, and then some of them are bound to turn out all right after a while.
Yeah, I can see that.
But you are right. It's not easy to write a short story just because it's short.
Right. Right.
So
Yeah, I'm a little scared of it.
it's still hard to write it well. And like Matthew said, you really have to accomplish a lot in a much shorter period of time. So in some ways, you have to be even more focused on what you're trying to do. But the upside is that you can do it. If it's only a couple thousand words, you can succeed, whether it's good or bad.
Right.
So, yeah.
And I want to take a brief aside because you guys both have mentioned first and third person. I know we'll probably do an episode on this in the future, but just for those of us like me, what do you guys mean by that? If for people who don't have too much history.
Well, first person is writing it as if you are the narrator, like using like I and me and those sorts of words. Mm-hmm. Whereas third person is what I think most books are written in, where it's he, she, they.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right. I just want to, I understand.
From an outside's perspective.
Just thought it would be good to throw that in there.
Yeah, definitely. So short story is definitely one kind of story type.
And I think really like short stories are also really good because you don't have to like flesh things out too much. Like you can focus on like one character, and it gives you practice like building characters and defining their personalities and exploring interesting plot points, but in a more limited sense. So you're not sort of constricted by the broader implications of your plot because there are no broader implications.
Yeah. Now that I'm writing not a short story, but a sort of a longer piece of writing, whatever you want to call it, I would actually get a little more interested because now I have all these characters that I haven't developed, and maybe I should develop them within the book I'm writing. But at the same time, I kind of think of little side stories that might not fit in the book that maybe that would be a good way, at least for me, to get into short stories, use some of the characters I already have. So I'm not starting from scratch.
That's a great idea. And I think I can say here on the show that Matthew is a big fan of Brandon Sanderson.
It's true.
And a big fan. And I believe that Sanderson does a lot of that, making novellas and short stories that connect to some of his longer novels.
Yeah. And they sort of can give context to like a specific character or like an event that happened off screen in the main books, that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. And I think it's a great tool, even if they're not like, even if you don't put them out to the world or even edit them or whatever. Sort of accompanying short stories can be helpful just to develop your characters or your world in your own mind and just to give you new ideas for it too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. I think maybe some future show we might talk about ways that you can share your work. And it does seem like there are ways that short stories can be published online or shared in different ways. So
yeah, published authors, independently published authors do that a lot. I think they'll, they have their books for sale, but then they have these free giveaways that they do, either a prequel or a short story about a side character in between books that they'll give away on their newsletter. So,
and I'm thinking like literary journals and things too that publish.
Yeah, I have submitted some of my earlier short stories.
Yay!
Online on like online sci-fi fantasy magazines. But I mean, I've been rejected several times, but it just shows that like there is a market for that. And I have read some of those short stories on there.
Yeah.
I think a lot of like data, like your maybe fear of short story. I mean, not actually a fear, obviously,
it's an actual fear. You could say that.
It could come from like, it's just speculation that you haven't read a lot of short stories. So you don't really know the medium very well. So you don't really know what's expected. You don't know how it's supposed to go.
Yeah, that's 100% true. I don't know that I've ever read short stories other than as little things like epilogues and prologues and the occasional independent author thing like I just mentioned.
Right.
So novella, now that's a concept that I know very little about. Short stories sort of make some sense and a novel makes sense. So what's a novella?
Well, a novella, I've only read a couple novellas, so I don't have too much of an idea about them, but they're generally sort of between a short story and a full novel at maybe 20 to 50,000 words or something like that. There's also novelettes, which are a little shorter, maybe 10 to 20,000. And I think just the main thing here is that they just have aspects of both short stories and novels. I mean, you have to have more subplots and more characters and that sort of stuff, because otherwise it would just be very rambling. It would just be a short story that got overinflated and needs to be condensed. But also, a novella could be a novel that hasn't been fleshed out enough. So there's sort of a happy medium that you need to find if you're trying to write novellas, I think. And yeah.
Yeah, and I think if you're going to do it well, you need to have that word that you hear a lot these days, intentionality. So I'll just tell from my own experience, the first time I sat down to try to write something, and I had in mind that I was going to write a book.
Right.
And then I accidentally wrote a novella in the sense that it was short.
Right.
But it really wasn't a novella in intention or in
terms of like how much happened.
Characteristic. Yeah. I mean, I think it really was, like you say, it was a novel that just wasn't well done or wasn't fleshed out enough.
Yeah.
So a novella is not just like writing a novel and then it accidentally turns out short because you were kind of skimpy.
Right. Well, maybe.
So I think people that really write them, like Brandon Sanderson or others, I'm sure they have like a lot more knowledge about what they're trying to do than we probably do.
And it might fit along what I was saying about independent authors. I said short stories, but they could do a novella between things as well, or as a free giveaway.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's what Brandon Sanderson has done a bit.
Yeah. So last in the continuum is the novel itself. And I think, again, there's not any specific length, that it's going to vary by genre in terms of what's typical. But I think, roughly speaking, anything that gets over 50,000 words, anywhere in that 50 to 100, becomes definitely a novel. And like I said, some genres are going to have, by convention, much longer novels than others.
So what's our page range when we're saying 50 to 100,000?
I don't know exactly, but I think 50,000 words, which is the general like low point cutoff for what a novel is. I think that
sounds awfully low.
Pretty well accepted. I think that's around 200 pages or a little less, maybe 150.
Yeah, so that's a
that's a book. That sounds pretty reasonable. Yeah.
And that's what they do for NaNoWriMo.
Yeah.
They try to get people to write 50,000 words,
which is National Novel Writing Month.
National Novel
Where you are tasked to write 50,000 words in the month of November.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So that's the direction that I went. And well, that's the direction essentially that we all went. I know you guys have some history with the short stories and accidental novellas. But we all went with the novel direction because, I wanted to write a book.
Yeah,
a whole book.
It's sort of the societal, or sort of a societal expectation, I guess. It's like, it's in the culture that like, I want to write a book. Like writing a short story doesn't feel like as much of an accomplishment because it's not something that people really talk about very much.
That was my reasoning, to have the accomplishment, I think, of writing a book.
Yeah. For me, it was mostly just like, if you have a lot of ideas and like disparate characters and stuff, you really need all the pages to be able to bring that together. And it makes it harder because you have to keep track of everything and make sure it flows properly. But it's also, I think, the most rewarding story type.
And I feel like from our own experience, I think it's most common for people to read books or to watch movies, to have that experience in your own reading and viewing of things that are a little bit more complicated, more characters, longer length. So it makes sense to try a novel in addition to the sort of the accomplishment piece. I think we do have less experience in general with things that are shorter, although that could be different now because like younger people like Matthew here who check out more stuff online, there are a lot of things that are shorter now.
Yeah, that's certainly true. Although I think, at least for me, the novel is still the majority of the reading that I do.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And like you mentioned, for me, having not read short stories, I wasn't thinking to write short stories. but obviously I read plenty of books, so
Yeah, and
that
you
makes
have, so
sense.
you have sort of an idea of like, how does a book go? Like, what's the, even if it's completely unconscious and you couldn't describe it to someone, you know the basics of a book.
Yeah, it's funny. It was completely unconscious. Although now, since we started writing, I've been, and I think we mentioned this, but I've been paying attention to stories that I read a little bit more. I still just read for pleasure, but paying attention to the stories a little bit more, and sort of how stories are told, and sort of the bigger picture themes that are sometimes repeated here and there within stories. So that has been fun. But yes, writing a novel is what we're all essentially talking about for at least recently. That might change in the future.
And novels are sort of a weird, like, because they start at 50,000 words, but they can go, it just keeps going up. I mean, 50,000 words, 500,000 words, they're both novels, which is sort of weird because that much of a change in word count, I feel like changes the medium a lot, and like what can be accomplished, what sort of structures need to be in place for it to work out.
Yeah,
So-
that's interesting because you read fantasy, and there are novels that are really, really long.
Very, very long.
And I know we were going to talk today a little bit about series being, a series of books that relate to the same characters and world and all that. But an actual novel that's 1,000 pages is not really quite the same as a series of books either.
And what I've seen is that some authors, like if they have really long books, they sort of split it up in their minds, or literally split it up on the page into different sections that are like, that each have their own sort of mini structure. So you still get some sort of satisfying payoff after a certain point, so it doesn't just keep dragging on.
I wonder why those authors don't just take their books and split them and make them a series of books and sell them individually.
Well, I think that sort of gets into like genre expectations, because fantasy books are known for being long.
Yeah.
But
and if it's a series, you don't want to have like a 30-book series generally.
Right, but you and I both have read really long epic fantasy books that are series where there's 5 or 10 books that are each 1,000 pages.
Yeah.
So that certainly exists too.
And I think Matthew and I have talked about this a little bit. It's one of those many conversations about now versus the old days. And I really think in the olden days when I was a girl and reading, growing up, and probably you too, there were not nearly as many book series as there are now. Well, I'm saying that might not be factually true. I feel like that's the case, that series were less common and it was much more common to read standalone books. And maybe it's partly because certain genres have become more popular, because I guess there were always series in maybe
science fiction and fantasy,
mystery or romance. I don't know. So you know what?
Well,
I might take that comment back because it might not be true.
Right, because I'm thinking like, well, maybe for kids, I was thinking sort of Nancy Drew or something along, or Little House on the Prairie. Those were all series kinds of things.
And I read a few of those. I guess I just when I watch Matthew reading, and I remember myself reading as a teenager, a mid-teenager, I don't remember reading so many things that were series. But you guys, and I think myself too, you really like series, right?
I love series. I strongly prefer them. I don't know why. I guess you're into the story, so you just sort of want it to keep going. And it's always, sort of bittersweet. You want to get to the end of a book, but then it's over. But with a series, you get to the end and then there's more.
Yeah.
So you've got a little hope that, you can get to the next one.
And it can just keep building and building, like just fleshing out more stuff and making the world bigger and the story bigger and everything bigger, which is really nice.
And the story I'm writing, I'm expecting to write more of, unless it really just starts falling apart, which, is always possible.
So you're both writing in a genre fantasy that tends to have series. So did you start your writing process then imagining your book as part one or book one of a series?
Personally, I imagined it that way, but without any actual plans at all, even remotely, for how other books would go. And I think most people don't do that. But for me, the end of my book sort of is a point at which more things can happen and makes a lot more sense because that's when, for me, that's when my magic system is or magic starts in my book almost.
Yeah, like the end of a book, or at least your book, and I think most books in series, like they wrap up the stuff from that book, but they also add on more questions that can be explored later in the series.
Yeah, and that's a writing challenge that we'll have to talk about later in the show, but how, if you are writing a series, how you keep that sense of continuity between the books. In some ways, they each have to stand alone, but in other ways, they're part of a bigger thing. So as a writer, how do you kind of find that balance? I know I am just at the very, very early stages of exploring writing a cozy mystery. And that's another genre that tends to have series really commonly. And some of the advice that I'd read for that genre is really just saying, don't even start your first book unless you've already thought of a setting and a group of characters that can give you a series of books. So I actually took the time, well, I'm taking the time right now. I'm trying to squeeze some good ideas out of my brain, but to have 4 or 5 very rough ideas already sort of in place before I even get started on the first book.
And I think that sort of gets into the marketability aspect of series, which is like,
right,
people like to read series, especially in specific genres like cozy mysteries, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
But people, at least today, maybe in the past too, enjoy the feeling of like being in a world or in a setting at least where they're going to stay there for a while and they get
Mm-hmm.
to know the characters, and you can get more of a connection when you have a series that carries on.
Yeah, it's like in the old days when we used to watch TV. Olden days alert.
Yeah.
But I know you don't watch much TV anymore, but we used to watch TV, and there would be shows and you watched them every week, right, Michael?
Right.
And you knew the characters, and each one was its own unique story, but they all hooked together, and you had that sense of each week going back. And so I think people just, as humans, we like that idea of getting familiar with a world and invested in it so that we want to kind of continue to stay with it.
Yeah, certainly.
Which is not to say there aren't tons of amazing things written that are standalone.
Right, of course.
Obviously. But in our genres and kind of in our own experience. So just as a little teaser for next time, since we've all said that we have a little bit of a series mindset, how does that affect your writing?
Well, for me, I feel like I don't necessarily, the book that I wrote already, which is sort of split up into 2 parts, I don't have thoughts of a sequel at the moment, but if I think about it, like I can see a very clear avenue where a sequel could go. Like it wasn't necessary in my outlining process because I wasn't really thinking about the series, but there's always potential for it. And especially in fantasy where you've already put some time into the world and stuff, and you sort of want to stay there.
Mm-hmm. The one thing I've noticed is that it makes me feel a little more relaxed about the descriptions and all the details. Sometimes I feel like I can get something started maybe in the first book. Now I'm just saying this because I haven't actually done it, but hypothetically, I could get something started and I don't have to go the whole 9 yards in the first book because I have subsequent books that can develop, especially some of the subplots and things like that can get developed a little bit later.
Although it also brings in the problem of like at the beginning of each new book, you sort of have to, or you might not have to, but you at least have to think about re-explaining things that already happened in the first book and like
right.
to what level you want to do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
If you like try and sprinkle it throughout, or you put an unrelated like section at the beginning just saying what happened in the first book, or
yeah,
for me, I like the series approach. And if my book was decent enough where you weren't bogged down in sort of the poor prose or something like that, and it got to a point that it was an enjoyable book, you would really want to read the next book because it certainly does. Even though it finishes, I'm planning to leave it in such a way that you really want to find out what happens next.
And I'm guessing that almost every book ever written, every standalone book ever written, even though it leaves the reader satisfied, it also leaves the reader, there could be some further development. So,
well, speaking of leaving people wanting a little bit more,
because this is so awesome.
Fascinating. Anyway, we're going to wrap up. Thanks for joining us today, and good luck with your own writing journey. Bye.
Take care.
Bye.